Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for braving the floods and getting over your 12th night celebrations and so on. So, climate change. We're going to be talking about climate change, or bits of it, really, for the next 15 minutes. And obviously, you will have heard so much about climate change perhaps already this morning, or as you're going around the hall and the stands next door, or certainly on the media, you'll be well familiar with the impacts of climate change. We saw the dreadful fires around the Mediterranean last summer, and we're well aware of the melting of the polar ice caps and so on. But of course, climate change isn't just something that's over there and far away. It's happening to us all here right now. We're all very aware of some of those exceptionally hot, dry summers that we've had recently, and not just the hot summers, but the milder, wetter winters too. Those of you who have come from Barrington direction will be aware of the problems with the wetter winters that we're having. And you'll know, of course, that climate change, the climate crisis, is being driven by the output of greenhouse gases. And there's a broad range of, if you like, engineering solutions to that. And you will have heard some of them today, and many of them you'll know already. Fitting solar panels on your roof and changing the heating system and using an electric car and so on. So there's a lot of those, what we might call engineering solutions. There are also land-based solutions. Tree planting would be the one that we've seen a lot of in the media, but there's lots of other approaches as well. And we're going to be focusing largely on those land-based solutions now. If we look at the statistics of what land is used for in the UK, agriculture is perhaps not surprisingly the biggest user. Second down is forestry, open land and water. So those are the two biggest categories, and there will be plans through DEFRA and other government agencies to ensure that those land use sectors try to meet their climate change requirements, the 2050 net zero requirement and so on. So that's all there. We're not going to be looking particularly at that. But you might be surprised to see that the third biggest category of land use in the UK is residential gardens. Comes out as 5%, it's not a big number, but in terms of square miles, it's almost 2,500 square miles. So it's about twice the area of Cambridgeshire, so it's a not insignificant amount of land that is managed by individual gardeners and homeowners. And certainly it's bigger than all the UK nature reserves put together. So it's a significant amount of land. And perhaps again, the surprising thing is that despite this 2,500 square miles, that there isn't a government agency specifically looking at what to do with this. Those other sectors are taken care of, and DEFRA, I'm sure, is doing their best on the other sectors. But with residential gardens, it's kind of down to you and I and anybody else who has a garden to try to do what they want to do or what they feel they should do with their garden. To be fair, the Royal Horticultural Society has published a document. It's available online. It's called Gardening in a Changing Climate. And it talks about mainly adaptations, what plants you can plant that'll do well in a changing climate. It's a very detailed, it's a very worthy document, but it's not necessarily a how-to document. It's not something you can pick up and say, that's what I'll do in my garden. And so over at Sue and I, we're involved with West Wickham Gardening Club. In West Wickham Gardening Club, West Wickham, maybe you know it, I don't know, it's the other side of Linton, it's in South Cambridgeshire, it's over there. So in our gardening club, we were concerned about climate change and felt that we wanted to do something about it. So we teamed up with other nearby gardening clubs. And last summer, we held a gardening and climate change day, similar in some ways to what's going on next door. And in here, we had talks and stands and so on. And we're now forming a group that'll dedicate itself to identifying and implementing measures that gardeners can do to address climate change. And the measures in broad sense that we've nailed down are one option is to accept and adapt to the changes. This is the stance that the RHS kind of follows. It's saying climate change is coming. There's not a lot we can do about to stop it, but at least we can get the right plants in our garden and continue to enjoy our garden. So it's a little bit passive, but it's for many people, it's a nice option. The other one is saying, well, climate change is happening. It's having a variety of impacts, perhaps on biodiversity, for example. What can I do in my garden to soften those impacts? How can I use my garden to soften the impact? Moving on from that, we could try to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions from our garden, a variety of measures there. And then finally, we could even use our garden to capture carbon. And we're going to talk through those very quickly now. We're just going to run through that. So back to the beginning, accept and adapt. We shrug our shoulders and say, how can we keep our garden looking nice? Well, there's some good examples of that, around the east of England. Cambridgeshire Botanic Garden has got a dry garden, and that's a very good example of how you can have a garden that doesn't require any watering. It still looks very nice. RHS Hyde Hall down in Essex, I don't know if you've been there. They've got a beautiful dry garden. It's very much an exotic dry garden. It's not necessarily easily translated into what you might do in your back garden, but it's well worth a look. And Beth Chatto, of course, is the sort of grandmother, perhaps, of dry gardening here in the east of England. All those worth a look, and you'll get a lot of ideas about plants you can change instead of your ones that are suffering. The other thing we might want to do with our gardens is, if we think back 20 years, the aspirational English garden had a big terrace with lots of garden furniture on it and people sitting in the sun. Now, when temperatures routinely reach the high 30s, that isn't going to work so well. So, like continental gardens, we're probably going to find ourselves planting more shade, whether it's a shade tree or whether we use a vine or some such to produce that shade so we can sit outside in the middle of the day, without frying ourselves. So that was accept and adapt, softening the impact. So let's have a very quick look at some of the measures we can use to soften the impact. Well, harvesting rainwater has got to be one of those. By harvesting rainwater, we can continue to keep the plants we have got doing well. Your standard 200-litre rain butt is probably not going to be enough for most gardens. You're going to need more than that, and people are increasingly buying not just more tubs, but also larger tanks. You can get a 1,000-litre tank, for example, and it's easy to fill those tanks. It doesn't take much of a roof to fill up with, a ton or several tons of water over the course of the winter. And the other thing about collecting rainwater and using that on the garden instead of tap water is you're reducing pressure on the tap water system and therefore water abstraction. And the river, the River Ree here will know all about, Shep will know all about increased abstraction and the problems that can have on river flow levels. And as well as simply the water, there's a lot we can do to our garden to boost biodiversity. Putting in a pond is perhaps the most obvious one. Farmland ponds are disappearing very rapidly, partly because of changes in agriculture, partly also because of these long, hot, dry summers. And when the ponds dry up, then the wildlife in there dies as well. So ponds are a relatively simple major boost of garden biodiversity, and letting your lawn grow long. We've had some lovely discussions on the stand at the back of the hall there this morning about people growing long lawns and the wildlife that came as a result of that, and the challenges in cutting the long grass when you reach the end of the summer. So that's important, and it's important that we see these sorts of measures not just as you in your garden doing this one little thing, but as part of a network of green oases dotted around the village or wherever you happen to live, so that there's this pathway or network, these green corridors that wildlife can disperse through. And whether it's the dragonflies or the butterflies or the newts or the frogs can go from one to the other. And it's not just the animals that live in the grass or the water. Animals like hedgehogs, for example. There's a hedgehog stand out here today. Hedgehogs need to drink every day, same as anything else. And if there's not many little ponds in your residential area, then the hedgehogs have got to walk a long way, and that means crossing the roads. And we know what happens to hedgehogs crossing the road. So the more ponds there are, the less distance the hedgehogs have to forage, the less likely they are to end up two-dimensional trying to get across the A10. So moving on, reducing our carbon dioxide emissions. There's a lot of things we can do here. And like I said, this isn't an exhaustive presentation. This is just giving you an idea of the sort of things that could be done and some of the things that in our Climate Change Gardening Group, we're starting to focus on moving away from petrol-powered garden tools, if you can, and moving to electric, particularly if you've got a green electricity supplier. Thinking twice before you put in extensive hard surfaces. Cement and brick industries are major producers of carbon dioxide, and when we're using cement and bricks, then we are supporting those industries. So the more that we can minimise the areas of hard surfaces or use recycled materials, the better it is. And of course, terraces like this, we've all heard so much in the last 72 hours about flash flooding. Terraces like this will just shed water and perhaps onto the road and contribute to runoff in areas. And by being concrete slabs, they're not grass, they're not pulling carbon dioxide out the air. So there's a kind of a big win-win in moving away from hard surfaces in the garden. I'm not saying dig up what you've got. If you've got it there already, stick with it. But think twice before you start a new one. Staying with reducing our carbon dioxide emissions, think about where you buy your plants from. If you grow them yourself, fantastic, through cuttings and seeds and so on. But about half of the plants sold in UK nurseries are imported from overseas, and they are essentially mass-produced because that's what's worked well for them, which requires lighting and heating and subsequently transport and so on. So nursery plants, the imported ones, will have a significant carbon footprint, which you can sidestep by growing your own. It's worth looking at the environmental tab at the bottom of garden centre websites to see what they're doing and what they're not doing. Well worth a look. Staying with reducing emissions, of course, homegrown produce has a much smaller carbon footprint than commercially grown produce, especially imported commercially grown produce. So think about increasing the size of your veg patch or putting a veg patch in there. And then finally, we've been, as gardeners, sort of brought up to think that digging is a good thing. And in some ways it is, but the downside of digging is that each time we turn the soil over, we expose the carbon in the soil to the atmosphere, and that carbon in the soil then oxidizes off as carbon dioxide, and we lose carbon from the soil and contribute to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. About 40 to 60, the Environment Agency estimate that 40 to 60% of the carbon in UK soils has been lost as a result, partly of intensive agriculture and partly as a result of urbanisation. Now, we can't do anything about farming, at least not immediately, but we can manage our own 2,500 square miles of private gardens to help put carbon back in the soil. And then we can move on from not losing carbon dioxide to the air to actually capturing carbon. And we can do this through planting perennials, plants that don't need replanting every year, ones that we put in the ground and they stay in the ground. Their leaves will fall to the ground, the worms will pull the leaves into the soil and put carbon back in the soil. And whether it's perennial shrubs or whether it's actually trees, in general, these plants are much better at trapping carbon than annual plants. And of course, we can use mulch and compost as well to put carbon back in the soil and try and get something back to those pre-intensive agriculture levels. So just finally, last slide, I mentioned at the beginning this little group Sue and I are involved with in West Wickham, Climate Change Gardening Group. We had an event, as I mentioned, last summer. So here we are, there's a hall with talks, much like this hall here now. And we had a variety of stands. We had a bookshop come along with a beautifully curated collection of environmental and gardening and climate change books. And we had a demonstration of scything as one way of dealing with your long lawn. So we got a scyther come along, and so on and so forth. So we had good fun. We are now in the process of forming an organisation, possibly a charity, with the objective of encouraging gardeners to manage their plot, to see gardeners as mini landowners, to manage their plot, not only to enjoy, which of course is, really why we've got garden, but also to use that plot as a way of tackling some issues around climate change. We've got a website there. There's a limited amount on it at the moment, but in the near future, that will be expanding to include a whole lot more information. I'm done.
Thank you very much. time for one question. I'm getting mean, I know.
Yeah. If you were to plant one plant for wildlife, what would it be?
It's going to depend on the size of your garden,
A
but
flowering, not a shrub then, not anything big.
not a shrub.
Maybe an exotic one or a native one.
I would go down the direction of native plants, and I'd almost...
Sea holly.
Sea hollies are good, you know, bees love sea holly. I would almost wonder about, do you really need to plant another plant, or do you need to leave a patch and see what comes up by yourself? In our garden, some of our garden we leave in that way, rather than putting new plants in. We say, let's leave this bit and see what happens. We've been amazed at the diversity of stuff that comes up. So if you've got some of your garden that looks lovely already, take a risk on another area. Don't plant the new thing you're going to get from the garden centre, or plant the seeds, but see what comes up. But if you do want to plant something, because you want something to come up definitely this year because you've got people coming or whatever, then yes, sea holly is a great choice if you think that'll work in your garden. And it's worth saying that these measures that we've talked about here, unlike many of these other things like solar panels and electric cars and the rest of it, most of this you can start to do tomorrow. You don't have to wait for planning approval. You don't have to apply for a grant. You don't have to do any of this. These are low-hanging fruit in terms of climate change tackling measures that you can put in place yourself.